What's in a name? That which we call a rose would smell just as sweet. I might have to disagree with William Shakespeare on that one. Sure, a rose by any name would still smell as sweet as a rose, but if we had named them dumpsters, then I seriously doubt people would have dumpster bushes lining their homes. A name is more than just identification. A name is identity. If you don't believe me, perhaps you can ask Mr. Marion Robert Morrison or Miss Norma Jean Mortensen Baker. Not familiar with those two? Well, perhaps it's because I didn't tell you what they changed their names to. Mr. Marion Robert Morrison changed his name to John Wayne. And Miss Norma Jean Mortensen Baker, well, she changed her name to Marilyn Monroe. A name isn't just about identification. It has to do with identity. In our passage, God changes Abram's name from Abram to Abraham. We'll talk about the significance of that a little bit later. But let's walk through our passage and see if we can figure out everything that's going on. We're told in verse 1 that Abram was 99 years old. The Lord appeared to him in this vision. 99 years old. And God is coming to Abram with a vision about what's going to continue to happen in the future. Not a vision at the end of Abram's life, but a vision about how it will continue to unfold. But I think we have to understand the timeline to understand where our passage fits in. You see, Abram is called by God. It's recorded in Genesis chapter 12. He's called by God to leave everything he's ever known and to go to a place that God will show him. He's not even told where he's going to. He had to put complete faith and trust in God. And he did. And what's more is that this first call from God on Abram's life came when he was 75 years old. Most people would be navigating the waters of retirement at 75. I can tell you, serving in a hospital in Dallas, I was with a number of families who lost loved ones who were aged less than 75. When we think of age 75, we think of someone who is in the latter part of their life. But God comes to Abram, and this is the beginning of Abram's journey with God. You know, we're just finished the professional football season, and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers won the Super Bowl, and quarterback of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers was Tom Brady. And everyone is making such a big deal of the fact that Tom Brady is 43 years old, well past the age when someone should be playing professional football. But Abram is 75 when he is called by God. The oldest, I had to look it up, the oldest Olympic medal winner recorded is a Swedish shooter by the name of Oscar Gomer Swan. And he won a medal at age 64. And Abram is 75. Again, we think that this is towards the latter part of Abram's life, and his life is winding down at this point, but God comes to him and he says, I want you to go, I want you to leave everything you've ever known, and I want you to settle in a land that I'm going to show you. Abram had to show complete faith in God to go, and at such an advanced age. But he did. He went. And God gives him this promise when he tells him to go. He says, I'm going to make you into a great nation. I'm going to make your name great. Those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. And all peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. God says to Abram, when Abram is 75 years old, go, leave everything you've ever known and go to a land that I show you. And he promises him these things, that God's going to bless him, and that in turn, Abram will be a blessing to others. So Abram goes, and there's some ups and downs along the journey, but years and years later, we still haven't come to a point in time in which we're seeing those promises of God fulfilled. God said, I will make you into a great nation. And so we have the assumption that God is going to give Abram and his wife Sarai children. But at age 75, they didn't have any children. And years later, they still don't have any children. And so they take matters into their own hands. It had been a delay of 11 years since the initial call at 75, and now Abram is about 86 years old, and nothing has happened yet, no children. Now I had to look it up. The longest delay in history in terms of a flight, commercial airline, ended up being 1 month. The Pacific Clipper was a Pan Am flight in New Zealand on December 7th, 1941, the day of infamy, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And because of the chaos, the Pacific Clipper couldn't return back to the United States. And so they ended up staying in the U.S. Embassy there in New Zealand for a week. And eventually they were told they could return to the U.S., but they had to go the other way around the globe. So they eventually accidentally became the first commercial flight to go all the way around the world. But in those days, they had to secure their own supplies, and it took longer. And so it took 1 full month for the crew to make it back home. 1 month delay. Abram and Sarai have been delayed 11 years, and nothing is happening. You would think at this point, if God was going to give them children, he would have done so already. And so they take matters into their own hands, which of course is the wrong decision. I can think of a number of times in my life where things haven't turned out the way they should have or could have or would have. And usually if I trace the history, I find somewhere along the path where I've taken matters into my own hands. I've attempted to speed up the process or take a shortcut. So Abram and Sarai take a shortcut. Sarai noticed that God hadn't provided them with children yet, and so she said, Abram, why don't you take my maidservant and see if you and she can have a child? And so Abram and Hagar have Ishmael. Now again, this is 11 years after the initial promise, and the relationship between Hagar and Sarai sours, and more than once Hagar leaves. Once when she's pregnant, and then she is told by God to return, and then once when she has the child Ishmael, she runs off because Sarai is mistreating her. And God again tells her to return because God sees her misery and hears her misery. And God provides. She returns um, back to be with Abram and Sarai, and Ishmael grows up into a young man. And this is 13 years later, when Abram is 99 years old. Just the other day, I was calling residents to check in, and I called on a resident who had a caretaker with them. And the caretaker answered the phone, but I made the mistake of assuming that I was speaking with the resident, a resident who is in their 90s. And so I made a statement as if to indicate that I thought I was speaking with the resident, and the caretaker was incensed and thought it was ridiculous that the resident could have answered the phone by herself because of her advanced age. Abram is 99 years old, and God comes to him again. I think it would be fair to say that Abram wasn't expecting another visit from God. He came to him when he was 75, promised him these things, and then that was that. Nothing else happened. They never heard from him again since then, and so they took matters into their own hands, and Hagar had Ishmael, and Ishmael grew up to be a young man, and then God returns to Abram. In verse 3, it said Abram fell face down. I think it would be fair to assume that Abram assumed an appropriate posture of worship, but also perhaps one of surprise, not expecting God to return. And God changes Abram's name. He changes his name from Abram to Abraham, because he said, "For I have made you a father of many nations." There are three new aspects to this covenant, this promise that God is making to Abram. The initial one, he said he was going to make his name great. He was going to make him into a great nation. He would bless those who bless Abram. He would curse those who curse Abram. And all peoples of earth would be blessed through Abram. And then he comes to him 25 years later, 13 years later after the birth of Ishmael, Abram's son, and Hagar's son. And he says, "I will make you the father of many nations." Not just of one, but of many. Kings will come from you, and this will be an everlasting covenant. And because of this occasion, God changes their names from Abram to Abraham, and from Sarai to Sarah. Now, like I said, names aren't simply just to identify people. That's more or less what they have become for us. My name ultimately serves to identify me and distinguish me from other people. If we all had the same name, it would be difficult to tell each other apart. Names help us in identifying people. But in the ancient world, names were more than that. They were identity. The name itself carried with it meaning. And God gives Abram and Sarai new names. What's interesting is that later in the passage we discover that Abram advocates for his son Ishmael. But God makes it clear that this promise that he made 25 years ago, when he told Abram to get up and go to a place that he would show him, he made it clear that he would give Abram and Sarai a son. And as he as he reassures them of this promise, of this covenant, he changes their name. He changes who they are. Not simply changes how they are identified, changes how they appear to everyone else, but he changes them. And he changes it. It wasn't because of anything that Abram or Sarai had done. It was because of a name that God gave them. See, when Christ enters our life, Christ changes us. We are no longer defined by our own merits, our own abilities, who we are, who we aren't. We are defined by Christ, by his mercy and grace and goodness and forgiveness. When God looks down to see us, he looks through the cross to see us, so that we no longer carry an insufficiency. Jesus has more than paid our debt. When Christ enters our life, he changes us. He gives us a new identity. He gives a royal and extensive kingdom to be a part of. This covenant that we are invited into. And you're never too old to participate. Amen.